one could question what is the point about studying Austro-Marxism, which is a theory that inspired the political practice that was defeated 19 years ago and which has since then been denied by the party that has been its bearer. Well, certainly you can say that the old Austrian social democracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the source of the socialist movement, which emerged in the 19th century, and which why it provides the language, is a sort of Rosetta Stone for the different socialist and communist currents in the region. And it's also true that there exists an intimate connection to left socialism in Germany, as demonstrated by Michael Kretke in a recently released book. Yet you still can ask whether this is enough to justify the effort. Is it timely? Is it a timely topic, since whatever you may say, Austro-Marxism failed with regard to its programmatic goal, which was ushering in socialism by peaceful means. That is what, for example, the communists accused them until the 1980s. See the entry in the Marxist-Leninist Dictionary of Philosophy, published in 1971. I mentioned this, by the way, because an old friend of mine, Michael Häupl, who later became the mayor of the city of Vienna, used to tease me by quoting the first sentence of this entry. I quote now: Austro-Marxism is a variety of revisionism whose point of departure was the blinkered petty bourgeois attitude vis-à-vis the national question. Meanwhile, we know that real existing socialism has not fared better than Austro-Marxism in terms of failure. Thus, why not shutting down what appears to be a museum of failed attempts? It seems to me that this is more or less generally accepted when it comes to socialism, even within the left. Nowadays, avoiding the term socialism has become common, even when referring to the parties on the left of Social Democrats and Greens. One prefers talking on the radical left. And I find it amazing to see how different in terms of politics and programs these parties, who are referred to be radical left parties, are put into one basket. They range from the Czech CP, which is a traditional communist party, for good or for bad, it's not ours to just let's state this, while you have Syriza carrying radical left in its name, and at the same time trying to conquer PASOK's place in the political spectrum. Or you have the German Die Linke, which certainly would refute to be labeled radical, partially for legal and partially for political reasons. And it's against this background that we think that a deep and principled debate among the parties of the so-called radical left is required in a European scale about its goals. In 1944, in the Great Transformation, Karl Polanyi already mentioned wrote in referring to the political polarization besetting Europe in the interwar period that both fascism and socialism were rooted in a dysfunctional market economy. However, in its competition for mass support, the fascist answer was at a significant advantage, since it disposed of a spontaneous plausibility stemming from its generally conservative character. We must never forget that the fascist rebellion, its critique of the system, is homed in bourgeois ideology. For this reason alone, it would be absurd to sink to this discursive level by adopting a populist stance, imagining that in doing so, one is confronting fascism. And this is now my main argument. If we want to escape the deadly double bind between liberalism and populism, we must reconstruct socialism politically. That means not as a utopia or a promised land, but as a project, a plan of a real transformation, considering also the challenges posed to liberal democracy by nationalism and authoritarianism. And here especially lies the interest in the interwar period and Austro-Marxism as a strategic proposal. So what is it? Karl Grünberg, the founding director of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, who was the mentor of the bunch of young intellectuals who later became famous as Austro-Marxists, defined, I quote, those theories and mass movements which, in conscious opposition to private property, as the handed down foundation of our ruling social, economic, and legal order, demand and strive for the reconstruction of this foundation on the basis of common collective property. End of the quote. And indeed, while in 1980, while refusing the mounting of a council republic after the Bolshevist model, Austro-Marxists, and particularly Otto Bauer, never distanced themselves from socialism in this understanding, as Joseph Hindl, one of the last important Austro-Marxist intellectuals, remarked in an international conference in 1981. In what consisted their idea of democratic socialism? In Bolschewismus oder Sozialdemokratie, Bolshevism or social democracy, a booklet published in 1920, Otto Bauer, while expressing principled solidarity with the Bolshevik revolution, countered the thesis that Bolshevism is the only possible, the only effective method for any proletarian revolution. This, of course, is the idea which we find later in Gramsci's Notes from the Prison. However, in Gramsci's view, connected with the idea of a cultural and a political cleavage between East and West. Bauer saw it the same way like Rosa Luxemburg. He objected Bolshevism from a principal position. He writes that, I quote, "We must free ourselves of the superstition about the omnipotence of force and the omnipotence of the state. Bolshevism," he writes, "blocks this liberation." In the first election of the young republic, which called itself German Austria, a self-identification being worth a separate presentation, the Social Democratic Party became the strongest party and entered into a coalition government with the Christian Socials, believing that this would open the entry of a socialist transformation by democratic means. Their core strategy for this was socialization. A parliamentary socialization commission was established, led by Bauer, and he elaborated on its goals in a 1921 published pamphlet, Der Weg zum Sozialismus, The Road to Socialism. In this space, I can only highlight one important feature. Differently to Hilferding, he preferred socialization to begin with the heavy industry. The enterprises were to be merged in industrial associations and headed by administrative councils made up of representatives of the employed, the state, the consumers, and the other enterprises organized in the same association. And analogously, he intended to restructure the agrarian sector, the wholesale trade, and the banks. However, the main emphasis of Otto Bauer's exposition was not on the shift from private to public property. This was obvious. That was the goal of the Social Democratic Party. However, the easier task. He intended socialization against compensation, for which a wealth levy should make sure that the capitalist class itself would pay. However, his main interest was in the practice of socialist property, which he did not want to entrust to the government, which he regarded as ineffective in leading the economy, but to a system of self and co-administration aimed at the balancing of the interests of all directly and broadly involved groups. As we know, the plan was torpedoed by the bourgeois Minister of Finance, which, by the way, was at that time Joseph Alois Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist, who enabled the selling of the country's largest industrial company to a foreign capital group, thus making its socialization impossible. Which takes us to Austro-Marxism understanding of the state. Bauer's main argument was that socialism presupposes a state that by its nature is able to carry out social transformation. Yet the question was what such a state would look like. Would it be a new state, or could the state as it was be put into service for the social transformation? The question of the state became subject of a controversy between Otto Bauer and the leading constitutional scholars, particularly Hans Kelsen, the founder of the pure theory of law and the author of the main part of the Austrian constitution. Kelsen argued that the parliamentary democratic state is fundamentally neutral in relation to its social content, and that depending on the relation of forces, it therefore can serve socialist or capitalist goals as well. And that the social democratic coalition policy, after all, bore this out. And by the way, he defended this idea even after the war, at the height of the Cold War, passionately against Friedrich von Hayek, who claimed that democracy and socialism were mutually exclusive. Yet Bauer disagreed, countering that the coalition policy was only the consequence of a transitory equilibrium of class forces that sooner or later had to give way to the implementation of socialism or the complete restoration of bourgeois rule. On the other hand, the state which enabled the Social Democrats to govern in a coalition had been shorn of its military and repressive powers since it arose from the collapse of the monarchy, thus allowing for the emergence of a new quality of democracy, as already mentioned, a functional democracy. Max Adler, law professor and left-winger of the Austro-Marxist movement, retrospectively describes functional democracy as an idiosyncratic modification of parliamentary state life in which the political decision-making process is no longer occurs merely through parliamentary resolutions, but in which the consensus of the organizations of the major economic sectors was continuously to be sought, above all that of the workers and the employees. Bauer, full of his historic optimism, described this as an expansion of the idea of democracy as a government with consent of the governed. Käthe Leichter, one of the unfortunately underestimated female authors of Austro-Marxism, described functional democracy in more sober terms as, I quote, system of coaxing realized via the axiomatically demanded unity of the party. The key person in this system, she describes, was the shop steward, der Vertrauensmann, the most important psychological figure within the Social Democratic Party of Austria, neither an extremely authoritarian nor a revolutionary character. And this description is fascinating also because it coincides with how Jura Seufer, the famous Austrian author, describes the period of demise of the Social Democratic Party, also referring to this particular mental constitution of the key persons in its organization and its, I would say, strong paternalistic character. Adler, as mentioned, a loyal, however, leftist critic of Otto Bauer's strategy, concluded, "It should be noted that this is the reason why even a so-called workers' government, even consisting only of social democrats and even based on a social democratic majority, can never be a socialist government as long as the proletariat is not strong enough to wrest the economic power in the state to itself. From this arises the historic tragedy of every workers' government, which certain domestic situation can make necessary, the tragedy that it too can only be a manager of the bourgeois state, even though with very radical protections and support for the workers' interest. For it will be at the same time be called upon to represent state necessities, which are still the necessities of the class state of the possessors of the economic order." End of the quote. And it is impossible not to think of many historical and contemporary examples in this regard. In parentheses, the concept of equilibrium of class forces had a renaissance in the mid to late 1970s, when the Italian and the French Communist parties believed they had arrived in the anteroom of power and attempted conceptually to understand the problems which they would have to cope with when entering into the government of their countries. Retrospectively, it seems that the much more orthodox Communist Party of France, equipped with its theory of state monopolistic capitalism, has been much more faithful to the idea of adapting the existing state than its Italian comrades, at least the left wing of the CP were, who stood under the shock of the bloody end of the Allende government in Chile. Back to Austria. When the party was pushed back into the defensive, it held few still significant bastions, such as the Red Vienna, and the question was how to preserve its combat strength. Karl Renner, in his 1929 book entitled Wege der Verwirklichung, Paths to Realization, came back to the question of socialization and posits that socialization through the state is unthinkable as long as one does not really and permanently dominate it. What then, he asked, should a working class do that is excluded from political powers for the years to come? Renner contrasted to what he called Otto Bauer's politismus, the concept of socialization through self-empowerment. That is the idea of an economic democracy realized through works councils, trade unions, producer and consumer cooperatives, and numerous other forms of the working class's democratic self-organization. This new economy, he writes, can be prepared as a means of free organization, a means of purely economic nature, a means of transforming the economy from inside already in the womb of the old economy, end of the quote. Can it not, he asks, even within certain limits and despite all difficulties that the reigning capitalism imposes on it, carry out its own economy and have economic impact? This argument contains some relevance for the present situation. Renner, by the way, gives a quite original answer by saying that the working class would need not one, but two economic policy programs. One that it would implement as soon as it comes to power, and a program for self-help, for a self-reliant economy of the class, of self-empowerment through trade unions, cooperative, and economic democracy, realized in the democratic self-organization of the working class. To conclude, what kind of general idea of socialism can be derived from the debate outlined here? As I have said, I'm convinced that if socialists are not to turn into more or less radical left liberals or populists, they have to take up the issue of socialism in a serious and in a scientific way. That means we have to dismiss the idea of imagining socialism as a society of unlimited material possibilities. This is unthinkable simply due to the ecological limits of civilization. And it also is unsatisfactory from a theoretical point of view to sum up all the progressive agendas, ecology, feminism, democracy, social justice, and others in one grand narrative and call it socialism. As Rosa Luxemburg famously said, we must not think of history as an obliging salesgirl who rummages around among all good things to come up with what is desired according to the likes and the taste of everyone, and the socialist may select the best since they are the coming into the shop with the mandate of being the future rulers of the world. End of the quote. Karl Polanyi can be classified as an Austro-Marxist only in a very, very broad sense. However, in one decisive point, he shared Austro-Marxism's conviction, specifically that socialism means above all one thing: freedom. Freedom not in the liberal sense of an individual self-realization to the extent of the resources at one's disposal, but freedom as a solidary, rational shaping of social relations. The way in which people live their freedom is another matter, which also applies to the idea of democratic socialism. In individuating one's own ideas, a comparison with the view of critical outsiders is sometimes helpful. Joseph Alles Schumpeter, already mentioned, a contemporary, held for the bourgeois economists' eccentric view that socialism is the necessary consequence of capitalist decadence. However, he understood socialism as a societal mode of operation that is culturally indeterminate. This means that socialism would be compatible with different culture and value orientations, which requires a pluralistic public space for competing visions and political societal projects within the democratic socialist society. Thus, socialism, and that's one of the main ideas of Polanyi, not so much in the Great Transformation, but in the early works of the 1920s, for humanity will only be free when it knows what its ideal costs, for only if we can see an immediate, verifiable connection that can be traced in the most minute quantifiable, in the most minute quantifiable way between the sacrifices to be made and the progress at which we have aimed along the path to the realization of our ideals. Only then we human beings develop the impulses within us to unswervingly walk up the upward path. I would say in a nutshell that despite all the pathos, it is a certain skepticism grounding in the Kantian epistemology, which unites the most of the Austro-Marxist authors, which distinguishes the Austro-Marxist of socialism from the ones Lenin and Trotsky propagated, and anyway from historical revisionism of Bernsteinian type. Thank you for the attention.
Now I shall open the floor for questions. I already saw some questions in the box, but I shall remind everybody that the members of the floor and the keynote speakers on Zoom come first when it comes to questions, and after that the general audience. So I shall ask the keynote speakers or floor, do you have questions for Walter?
Yes.
Please, Michael Kretke.
Thank you very much, Walter. I agree with a lot of what you say. I just wanted to throw at you, well, apart from the defeat of the Austro-Marxist-led social democratic movement, which is undisputable, and the major errors, major mistakes made have also been included, already spelled out in the self-criticism by Otto Bauer and others. Apart from that, it is not by chance that the Italian communists and even the French communists rediscovered Austro-Marxism in the 1970s, because this is the only tradition where you get at least concepts and to a certain degree even programs of socialist politics in the Western European context, which are to some degree usable. You can still resume it. You can combine Renner's view of economic policy of the working class or the socialist movement with Bauer's views about, well, how to use the institutions of an established parliamentary democracy. There is hardly any alternative to that or any other option. So I think it is inevitable to rediscuss and to rediscover them once in a while. Still, whenever we start discussing the actual possibilities of economic democracy, well, we always fall back. That means all the specialists involved in that to the debates of 1918, 1919, 1920. And there are the most detailed and the most, well, convincing conceptions of what could be done within the context of highly developed capitalist societies, and preserving the basic elements of a democratic political and social order. So I wouldn't really see any alternative than to reread and scrutinize and of course criticize the Austro-Marxist concepts. It's a starting point and an inevitable one. Thank you.
Walter, do you want to answer question by question, or you want to collect all questions? Yes, Sean Numa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very interesting paper, Walter. Yes, when you speak about the French Communist Party as an influence of Austro-Marxism, Michael was right. It was very important in the 1970s, and probably you know, but it was very important in the French left too, because one people who is very famous in France, Jean-Pierre Chevènement, who was ministry in 1980, was convinced by Otto Bauer and Austro-Marxism theory, and after it disappeared totally. But when you read the newspaper and vertical organs, it's amazing, because Otto Bauer was very present in France during a few years, but he was very present in the inside the discussion, because Bauer was Marxist and open to the West European realities. And there was not so much theoretician who can combine these different things. So it's very interesting. And what I want to say too, that I was in China a few years ago, and I discovered some Chinese people who published Otto Bauer in China in 1980 during Deng Xiaoping's times. And it was interesting to discover that Otto Bauer was used to in order to define the new way of China at this moment. So what I want to say, I read a lot of papers, articles and chapters on Austro-Marxism in different contexts, but I don't know that it doesn't exist a kind of global history of the influence of Austro-Marxism for the moment. We have some articles, some chapters, but it doesn't exist, yeah? Please say to me if you have other references on this influence of Austro-Marxism in the left at the world level. And the other question is more theoretical, because Michael says that Otto Bauer, one of the few theoreticians you can use in 1970 when you are so a communist of social democrats. Okay, but what do you think about the link about Gramsci and Otto Bauer on different points? Because, for example, in the French left, we have all the people say Gramsci, it's great, Gramsci, it's a baiter for hegemony. They don't want anything about Gramsci or about hegemony, but they say always that Gramsci is the best and the only theoretician who has thought the link between the parliamentary institution and the Marxism. And what do you think about the difference and the common point between Gramsci and Otto Bauer? Of course, it's a big question, but I think it's important because for me, Otto Bauer is sometimes more interesting than Gramsci on different points. I know that Michael is agree too.
I agree completely.
And Gramsci, and it's difficult, as I say, for the question of nation to read Bauer because it's in a context, an Austrian context. But if you take it more generally, I think it's one of the most powerful theoreticians on different points. So, what do you think, Walter, about Gramsci and Gramsci and Bauer? Thank you very much.
We have other questions from the floor. Then let us collect the third question, and then let's give the floor to Walter again.
Thank you very much, Walter. I really enjoyed this.
Please speak in the microphone so
yes.
that it is recorded.
I forgot about that, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. I like that we're also kind of going from a historical overview to kind of discussing what is socialism today. And I would like to push you to sort of elaborate more on the conclusions. So when we're talking about socialism, especially in terms of the climate crisis and the economic crisis that we're going through right now, are we talking about, again, taking cues from all of these debates that you summarize, are we talking about socialism as just, state control and socialization? Are we talking about workers' control? Are we talking about some sort of future society without markets and wage labor and so on? What exactly is meant there? And the other question also, I guess, really what would be the relationship of internationalism there? Because it seems to me that, internationalism we always have as a buzzword on the left, but it always seems to be the first casualty of realpolitik, whether we're talking, about the Soviet Union or like Austro-Marxism as like also, democratic socialism in one country, if you wish. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on those two things.
4 points, and 2 of them are very closely related. I love Gramsci. Everybody loves Gramsci. What can you do else? but I share the point of view that from political theory, if you speak of political theory, the difference between Gramsci and Bauer is that Gramsci was the leader of a mass party, and he was obliged to think through every single question of how to achieve power, how to exercise it, how to defend it, how to defend the party in the face of the offensive of the opponent. So everything appears in Bauer. And maybe I must stress this, and this is actually the rationale of our effort in Transform. We believe that Austro-Marxism and Bauer is one of the most relevant sources to reconstitute the idea of democratic socialism. But at the same time, and in the sense of this Kantian skepticism, I would like to pour some skepticism in the debate. True, Bauer gave an excellent self-criticism in between two world wars, the crisis of socialism and democracy. But there is a blind spot, and this blind spot is the party. When you read his book about the illegal party, it's a wonderful historic analysis of different party types. I would say even it's the most advanced party theory. But at the same time, it does not acknowledge the problem of a hierarchical, paternalist leadership culture in their own party. And that's why Käthe Leichter is so interesting. She was a dedicated socialist. She defended the party even when she was in the concentration camp in Ravensbrück, but at the same time she was a feminist. And she had a certain sensitivity to cultural nuances which might be not relevant for judging the party in the 20s or in the 30s, but which are relevant when talking about party culture of nowadays. And the third or fourth question, yes, skepticism. I must mention this as an Austrian. I mean, it is strange that Otto Bauer, who was such a refined and cultured and knowledgeable person in national questions, completely failed when it comes to the national question of Austria. That's extremely paradoxical. And paradoxical as well is the fact that the turn of the Communist Party in the 30s to defending the idea of an Austrian nation actually was going back to Austrian Marxist ideas. I mean, Alfred Klar had to quote Stalin excessively, the notorious, I think 3, 4, 5, I don't know how many characteristics a nation has to have. And he had to do this, of course. It was a question of surviving under the conditions, being teacher at the Lenin School in Moscow. But at the same time, the methodology is Bauer's methodology, which in my opinion is best expressed in a footnote of the book of 1907, when he said, my question is not about what a nation is, my question is the making of a nation, the historical process of constructing a nation. And that was actually the argument with which the Austrian communists proved that Austria was a nation to be constructed. So last remark concerns the question of yours. I mean, it's an extensive and exhausting question. However, I would like to focus on one thing. That what Polanyi says is socialism is accountancy, meaning there must be a relation between politics and its effects. And this is freedom. And if this is freedom, you still can have very different point of views how to achieve ecological sustainability, or in which way social problems are addressed. People are for basic incomes, other ones think the most important thing is to achieve full employment. I mean, differences of this kind, this is a typical Austro-Marxist argument, are less ideological but rooted in material differences, and they must find expression in the political structure because socialism, as being accountancy, is an open project and not an ideal to which reality has to adapt. And I know this is not an answer to your question. It's just how I try to think about it.
It's a good starting principle. And of course, we can continue the discussion over lunch. So it's perfectly fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have another 5 minutes. Maybe we could open the chat and see if the audience, I remember somebody asked something. So very shortly to try to answer some points of the questions of the audience. So yes, we have only one, that made by Andrei Holub. He asks Walter Bauer why he thinks about the possibility that Otto Bauer's idea of the called integral socialism could be interpreted as significant other for Austrian communists regarding the normative aspects of event of February 1934. So I suppose, well, we have 5 minutes. So if you want to say something about that, Walter, please go ahead.
Maybe I missed the point in the question. I try to answer it in the way as I understood it. I think the relevance of the concept of integral socialism is because it paradoxically coincides with an idea which Lenin uttered in the book of imperialism, because Lenin in this book says reformism is not, so to say, a treason or can be explained through the personal characteristics of leaders, but is rooted in social realities. And that is what Bauer says, but draws the inverse conclusions in saying that the revolutionary tendency in the labor movement and the reformist tendency in the labor movement are materially grounded. And the question which we have to settle is, how can we put these two realities reflecting approaches into a productive relation? And nowadays, I would say we must go much further than thinking only of two tendencies of the labor movement. We must talk about feminism, we must talk about the ecological movements, but we must avoid to do this in a spirit that somebody has to teach somebody ideologically. Of course, the debate and discussion is necessary, but the first step must be to acknowledge that ideas are grounded in realities which ought to be understood. And this understanding, in my opinion, is the basis for creating political unity. Insofar, integral socialism is one of the most inspiring ideas of 20th century's Marxism.